Hello, Endeavor here. So tonight we're going to be talking about the book An Open Letter to an Open-Minded Progressive by Mencius Moldbug. I'm going to start off by giving a short description of the book for anyone who might not have read it. It's a critique of 21st century liberal democracy in which Moldbug addresses it to progressives who he views as the dominant force, the dominant ideological force in modern liberal democracy. And the books are a critique of the idea of Whig history. So it's a critique of the idea that history is progressing to become more and more enlightened and more and more free. And what Moldbug argues is that society is actually decaying and giving off the illusion of becoming more and more enlightened. And he identifies the driving force behind this as what he calls the cathedral, which is the intelligentsia. So this would include corporations, the academy, so universities, and the mainstream media. And he really sees this as the ones determining public policy, and that's what's pushing it. And Moldbug argues it's eventually going to destroy Western civilizations. And what he proposes is the abolishment of democracy and the abolishment of the influence of the cathedral as a solution. And I'm going to just start off by giving my take on the book, and I'll let these other gentlemen do the same in a minute. So what I'd say is I agree with a lot of his points on liberal democracy. I really thought that the points he made, it showed that Western society, as time goes on, is getting weaker and weaker. It's constantly weakening itself and making itself a lot less sustainable. And it's really just civilizational decay, but with the illusion of progress. And I would agree that I think I see the cathedral, so the intelligentsia, as the driving force behind this. And I might disagree with a few of his solutions, but we can get into that later. So I'll just let a few of these gentlemen give their thoughts on the book too. Maybe we'll start with you, Charles.
Okay. I guess following your train of thought, the thing I found most interesting about the open letter is his really sharp critique of so many of our foundational myths in regards to how we perceive ourselves, I guess, in relation to history, particularly in regards to what you said, how we have this worship of democracy as this sort of end-all be-all, a sort of end of civilization, like that's the ultimate form of government, and also this idea that progress is simply this good force. And I think the word itself is really shifty because progress itself is sort of a positive word, but when you think about it merely as a political label, like that's just the word that happens to be used by one side over the other. And one thing that Moldbug was really good at is sort of taking a holistic view of what this idea of progress is and kind of breaking out of the windowed look people tend to have on society, which is more of like a pendulum approach where things sort of swing back and forth. But really, when you look at it overall, say for the last 300 years, it's really sort of unidirectional which way things are going. So I guess that's my brief thoughts on it.
All right, we'll go with Intermezzo next.
Hello. So I also liked, so maybe this is because I brought my own thoughts into it and I have been kind of skeptical of the whole notion of progress too, but I kind of really, that kind of resonated with me when I was reading it. I tend to feel like really science is the progress of science. We kind of tend to conflate science with social progress. And so therefore our progress in science kind of masks the deficiencies that are happening with quote unquote social progress. I think one critique I would have is that he tends to like envision like a lot of like with the cathedral, it almost feels like maybe a little bit too conspiratorial for me. I think that a lot of the people who are members of the cathedral really are, they're honest actors. I think a lot of them truly believe that they're doing good. They're just misguided for the most part. And so that's kind of my largest critique of it.
All right, we'll go with Mauritian next.
It's been quite a while since I've read the book. It's been about a year or so, but I'll do my best to remember what I can. What this book generally did for me was it really opened me up to ideas that weren't purely of like a progressive or Whig history sort of bent. it really opened me up to a lot of different historical theories, and eventually I ended up deciding on the view of Oswald Spengler, at least at this point. But I would like to add on to something that Intermezzo said about it being very conspiratorial, and I might be mixing it up with the other Moldbug works I've consumed, but he really does have a penchant for attacking Calvinists and saying that they were largely due to this sort of decline that we're witnessing in the Western world. And I'm not sure that's necessarily accurate, although I would agree with him on the concept of theophobia and the destruction of tradition as a whole. And that's all I really have to add, at least initially.
And we'll go with the Distributist next.
I don't know. I don't think there's really a short summary of the book.
Well, just your thoughts on the book. Your thoughts on the book.
Even if I hated it, it would still be worth reading because it's the source of modern reactionary language. It's where we get the term the Cathedral.
Yeah.
It's where we get. Yeah. I mean, you said like the insight is that technology masks progress, but I think that was literally a thesis of this particular pamphlet. It's not a new thought, but certainly Moldbug kind of re-ups it in an open letter.
Yeah. So what I think what we can probably start off talking about is the idea of progress, and I think that Moldbug got a lot of it right, where he said that essentially we have this idea that we're progressing towards this kind of egalitarian, equal, more enlightened society, but it seems to be just an illusion, and society seems to be decaying from the inside. And what I'd say I gained out of it was that it really felt like it's making society a lot weaker and less sustainable. And
I mean, certainly, not to cut you off here, but on your own thing, but I mean, certainly the insight wasn't that progress is happening or that progress isn't happening. That's a classic conservative talking point. There is no progress. Myth of progress. You'll hear that from every conservative. The real insight is that the reason why there is this direction to history is that progressivism is an entropic force. It's the same reason that there's a direction to physics. And that is that there's a natural tendency for things to wind down. And the progressive direction of history is the process of civilizations winding down. I think that's what makes it sort of much more insightful, I think, right? So Mencius Moldbug doesn't so much deny the direction of history as he gives us a new way of interpreting it, which I think is much more useful.
But what I would say is I kind of interpret it more as like a cancer rather than I see it more as civilization kind of letting go of all of its institutions, letting go of all of its the kind of restrictions placed on people. And
I mean, yeah, you can see it as cancer too. Cancer is actually not so dissimilar, right? Because cancer is simply the genetic code winding down.
Yeah, that is true. So yeah, anyone else's thoughts on like the idea of kind of the progress of history and really like what it means, and
I can't remember if he mentions this explicitly in the letter or not, but does Moldbug mean to apply this idea of progress as a, I guess, this cancerous force to pretty much every civilization? Because mostly he just talks about modern Western civilization, like last 300 years or so since the revolution.
I don't know if he uses cancer. He does use entropy.
Yeah, sure. But whatever analogy, entropy, cancer. Does he intend it to apply to most civilizations, let's say?
I don't know. I would imagine that he does. I mean, that's the only way the theory works.
Yeah. Well, yes. It's using Western civilization as the example, but I would imagine that other civilizations would undergo the same thing with the force of the cathedral. So I would say that just places like, say, Japan or they seem to be undergoing the same kind of liberalization, which is kind of pushing them in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I mean, yeah, but I'm not sure how much of that is actually organic to their own respective high cultures, or whether or not that's simply just the influence of Western civilization in itself.
It's hard to measure now because Western civilization is such a global force, but maybe looking at more historical examples might make sense.
Yeah, Spengler does this quite a lot with a similar theory. In fact, the whole idea of civilizational entropy and circular history is a very old one. It dates back to even before Oswald Spengler. I think there's even some religions that have it integral to their systems.
Well, obviously Hinduism, right?
Yeah,
The Kali Yuga, whatever.
yeah, but I think that's more the actions of their weird pantheistic gods. Although certainly, I know for a fact that a lot of Dharmic faiths have this kind of concept down.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we should probably clarify. I mean, we may have different ideas on this, and what's really kind of wrong with the idea of progress, and really what's kind of wrong with the path that of progressivism. And for me, what I would say is what's really the problem with it is it makes civilizations more and more individualistic, more and more focused on the here and now, and less powerful, and less able to actually sustain themselves. So, for example, when they get rid of their traditions, they get rid of their value systems, it really prevents them from passing these things on to future generations, and they end up losing really what makes them a civilization to begin with. So yeah, what is anyone's thoughts on just really why the W force is probably not a good thing?
So I think part of it is I think there's this great phrase, Chesterton's fence. And so that a lot of, I really think that a lot of cultural and social traditions were invoked because they were actually highly beneficial for a society. You can go imagine like these cultural traditions as kind of an evolutionary process where eventually the best traditions get propagated onto the next generation. Well, this kind of quote progress is really kind of like a mutate. Well, it's kind of like taking down all these beneficial traditions simply for the sake of the individual, like you said. But eventually what happens is that without these, barriers, without these Chesterton's fences staying up, the society can't sustain itself. That's the fundamental issue with knocking all these fences down.
Yep.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I was going to say is I think what we're doing here is, while everything that's being said here is correct, I think we're missing out the fundamental cause behind a lot of the removing of these Chestertonian fences. So, for instance, if we take female suffrage and just general suffrage, I think a lot of it is due to, of course, the individualist values have expanded as a result, and of course there is less restriction on society. But I think rather than that being because of a conceited sort of group, like a really focused group of individuals trying to actively knock these down, I think it's as a result of the entropy which Moldbug mentions. Don't forget, when you're creating a culture and growing a culture into a civilization, you're taking a lot of energy, and as a result, you're going to have to pay that energy back somehow. As energy is spent, it needs to obviously go back into the system, and you've lost that. And as a result of that, you'll start to perhaps lose the resolution of certain societal rules, and over time, the society as a whole won't be able to retain them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's largely a result of the wealth generation and the rise of the moneyed classes and the upper middle class. So the upper middle class doesn't really need traditions to propagate itself. The upper middle class, like the people who I know who are typically upper middle class, they don't need traditions to live good lives or to live economically prosperous lives, at least. And so therefore they feel like they don't have a need to connect to them. And so it will, like, these traditions do subconsciously slip over the generations. I mean, you go take a look at a lot of Americans. How many Americans continue the traditions that they had in Europe when they were Europeans prior to their immigration? And the correct answer is very little. And I think part of that has to do not only just with the whole melting pot aspect of America, but partly because, when you have money and wealth, and you don't really need these traditions to continue, it's easy for these traditions to decay over time.
And not only will those people give them up individually, but as they will no longer teach them to everyone else. As more and more people enter the middle class, they won't be teaching these traditions to their offspring, and likewise the lower classes won't be learning them anymore. So even if you're not in that middle class to upper class area, you won't even know about these traditions because the people who are supposed to be dispensing them to you are in those categories.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. But how I would describe at least the upper middle class, at least as I've been aware of them, because I grew up in that sort of environment and I know a lot of them now, is they're kind of like the cuckolded children of Nietzsche in a way. And allow me to expand on what I mean by that. So, if anybody here has read The Genealogy of Morals, you'll be aware of the dichotomy between master and slave morality. And as a whole, whether or not they're aware of it or not, a lot of the upper middle class people that I know try to pursue this kind of quasi-master morality, or at least something very, very reminiscent of that. And that's where the children of Nietzsche part comes from, but I'd say that it's kind of cuckolded because they lack the energy and they lack the courage to truly make that Übermensch kind of thing manifest.
Yeah. I think one thing I also got out of the book that I don't think Moldbug might not have said this directly, but that I really feel that modern like liberal democracy, it allows itself to be subverted by hostile forces. And the part of the book where Moldbug talked about if Bolivia invaded Britain, he said, well, obviously Britain would win in a war. However, if Britain could only shoot when fired upon, they could only arrest someone on good suspicion. They needed to give them a free and fair trial. They needed to do all these these liberal they had to provide all these liberal rights to their other those trying to subvert them or be hostile to them flat out. It makes the society so much weaker, and I think you kind of can see that in modern Britain where the kind of restrictions put on your society, like the self-imposed restrictions, have actually allowed a lot of the Islamists to get away with a lot of the things that that a strong society clearly wouldn't allow them to get away with, because you can't you can't be prejudiced against them. You have to have all these limitations, and it's just whoever's going to go against that, they're going to end up winning.
And liberal democracy even invites in that subversion. It welcomes it.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me, actually. So, are you familiar with Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Harvard address? In his Harvard address, he also commented that. So basically, he went to Harvard, and he's this Russian guy from Soviet Russia, and he suffered in the Gulag, wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and all this stuff. So everybody thought, oh, he's going to go speak terribly about the Soviet Union when he's here. He's going to say about how our social democracy is so great here in the United States. And interestingly enough, he basically spent the whole hour of his speech basically telling about how the United States is a pretty terrible nation. How, like, even not necessarily that it's worse than the Soviet Union, but it just lacks the courage, and it lacks a lot of, specifically like the courage. But he critiqued the media in there, and he critiqued a lot of Western civilization from what he saw as kind of a source of weakness. For example, he kind of critiqued how the United States lost the Vietnam War because essentially the people who protested it had no idea what was going on, and how they didn't have the willpower to continue in the war. And I think that's a kind of an interesting connection. Sorry if that's off topic.
Mm-hmm. That was an idea that frequently came up in Evola's book, Revolt Against the Modern World, this sort of loss of a will to stand on firm moral ground, I guess you'd say. Like, we have a very fluid, relativistic morality where I find that people, even in day-to-day interactions, aren't really willing to take strong, not even just moral stances, but strong stances on anything. You can see this in a lot of like art criticism. It's kind of a tangent though.
Yes. Yeah. You really kind of do see the way that kind of the West's moral framework and just its kind of self-confidence is just really decayed over time, and we kind of get the sense that we're progressing, but it really just it clearly is it hasn't been the case in many of these as the book clearly shows. And I think the next thing we should address is Moldbug's conception of the cathedral. So what he identifies as the driving force behind the kind of liberalization of the West is the intelligentsia. So the universities, the academy, the media, the corporations, and these seem to really be dictating public opinion, and they seem to be pushing public opinion in this direction.
Well, I have to step in here
Oh, go ahead.
because
Yep.
both you and was it Intermezzo characterized this like it was a conspiracy of elites, but Moldbug goes out of his way to make the explicit point that this is not a conscious conspiracy.
Mhm.
As a matter of fact, the entire word for the cathedral came from him outlining a spectrum between type 3 societies. I think it's type 3, maybe I'm getting the order wrong, that are like Karl Popper's open societies, and type 1 societies that are like North Korea, or
Yes.
where the elites explicitly manage public opinion and decide it in committee. And then type 2 societies where he's essentially trying to walk us through why we don't live in a type 1 society, right? Or why we don't live in an open society.
Yeah.
But he really wanted the cathedral to represent not a conspiracy, but a broad tendency of all elites to agree on core principles, to the extent where the controversies that really should be controversies aren't even expressed or talked about in between institutions where you would imagine there might be a rivalry. Like he gives the example, why is it a ridiculous question to ask whether Harvard is more progressive than Yale? You know, why? I mean, you could say perhaps that Harvard is less progressive. Harvard's more progressive than the New York Times, but in that case, all that is to say is that the New York Times is behind Harvard in the evaluation of this particular discipline, right? And so I think if we're going to talk about the cathedral, we really have to make that distinction. If we're trying to take Moldbug at his word and not as how people abuse him.
Well, what I was going to say was that the cathedral seems to be something that has a life of its own. So, I mean, it doesn't really, it's clearly not like a room of people like, smoking in this room, deciding how they're going to, push policy. It really just seems to be, has taken on a life of its own where it kind of just, ends up being a consensus that really like all the voices that people consider reputable seem to be leaning in the similar direction.
Yeah, in one direction.
Mm-hmm. And it's completely decentralized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do any of you guys have any thoughts on this? Like, his interpretation of the cathedral. What you thought, how you thought. Do you think that it was an accurate interpretation?
One thing he does that I found kind of weird is he makes really sharp distinctions sometimes between like the journalists and the politicians and the institutions like Harvard and Yale and such like that, when basically that the journalists are acting as the mouthpieces for the colleges, when to be it kind of seems like that relationship kind of goes back and forth sometimes between those entities and sometimes the politicians themselves. I'm not sure if the way he indicates that the message is spread is always in that single direction.
I think it tends to be in that direction. I would say that Moldbug has a pretty good outline of how the process works in ordinary operation. I'm not saying that, you couldn't occasionally have a politician whose ideas found their way into people's doctoral dissertations, but when it gets to most of the things that we're dealing with right now, it's just undeniable that this went from the academy to the journalists to the politicians.
Yeah. And one interesting part of the book where you actually made a video about, Charles, was the part where he talks about certain politicians that have gone against the cathedral, which he lists ones that kind of ran at its head on, being Enoch Powell, Joe McCarthy, and George Wallace, whereas politicians that kind of went against it on issues were, say, Ronald Reagan. It was interesting what you said about Donald Trump's role and how he kind of seems to be fitting into that Ronald Reagan camp. Would you like to expand on that, Charles?
Sure. I mean, the basic premise here is I think people wrongly believe Trump to be in the type 1 category of total opposition to the cathedral, which I think he clearly isn't. He's the type 2 because, I mean, that's his whole strategy, right? Negotiation. And you see this all the time with things like DACA and Obamacare and the wall and his foreign policy. He's totally willing to make common ground with the cathedral, which means that he cannot destroy it. And I think that's why, to some extent, it was incompetence, but I think that's why he hasn't been totally destroyed yet, because he's not a real opponent of the cathedral. Now, it's possible that he could be a springboard for someone like that, but I think it's really important for reactionary people to realize just how much he compromises with it. I mean, he used to be a Democrat, and you see him make concessions all the time if you watch him, and I think it's totally rose-tinted glasses if you're not going to realize that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I suppose. I mean, I want to be like a constant humbug here, but I'm gonna pipe up and point out another big, insofar as politics is concerned, note on Moldbug's work, and that is his incredible skepticism to the feasibility of politics in the way that we're talking about. I mean, he frequently takes huge sections of the books to denounce political means to forestall the W force and to unseat the cathedral. He's incredibly skeptical of that.
Yes.
Right. So I don't think he would be surprised to learn that Trump opposed the cathedral on issues and then on others he's compromised.
Yeah. I would say that Trump's presidency so far, it is kind of I think you kind of can see the cathedral in action because he seemed to have started it just running it head on. And if you remember back in 2016, the media was saying, "Oh, he's Hitler. He's going to destroy our democracy." The stuff you'd expect if it were like, say, an Enoch Powell type. But once he's gotten to power, he's really kind of eased off a lot of that and really has made these compromises. And I kind of see it as a sign of the cathedral working, because it's gotten who would have been conceived as an enemy of the cathedral to kind of ease off on the things like the wall, America first.
But Trump doesn't really understand this stuff. His opposition to this stuff was purely opportunistic and coincidental.
Yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't like I'm going to oppose the cathedral. I mean, maybe Enoch Powell, right? But certainly not Trump. Even when you said like partial enemies of the cathedral, the person who came to my mind in American politics most recently would be Pat Buchanan. I mean, maybe you could argue that Pat Buchanan understands that maybe not in the Moldbugian terms, but he understands that there is something called the establishment and he is against it. But Trump, I mean, you're talking about like, I'm borrowing from Megan McArdle when I'm just saying most of the stuff is just A/B testing, It's just A/B testing. He does something, and if it plays well, he keeps it, right? That's what A/B testing means. Mm-hmm. So I'm not so sure. I think we might be trying to read motivations onto a cipher here a little bit.
Well, I don't think any of us think that he is even aware of the cathedral in any technical sense or is a real opponent of it. That's definitely what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, I don't think he is aware of it, but I feel like it's just kind of this thing that this naturally kind of happening naturally. So as in, I don't think he ever declared himself an enemy of the cathedral, but he kind of was that originally. I think that's kind of why the backlash was against Trump was, but I think kind of the reason he hasn't been destroyed is because he's kind of given into it. And like the point I was trying to make is that's kind of how the cathedral works. Like, right. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Moldbug mentions that in his letter, that politicians will compromise with it because they see that actually makes them more successful. And he references John McCain in this aspect. Like he's like the most compromised conservative ever, or something along those lines. And that's very enticing because power is enticing. So if it's going to strengthen your personal position, why not work with these forces? And that's what we see Trump doing.
Yeah. So would anyone else like to respond to that?
What is the question we're discussing?
Okay, well, anyway, I think another thing we can talk about is the book. It's a really damning critique of the conservative movement of really the last 100 years or so. because what Moldbug says is that essentially progressives are the ones pushing the W force, so the progress of history, whereas conservatives seem to be the ones who have accepted the progress thus far, but want to stop it here. And the analogy that I heard was that it's kind of similar to if someone jumped off a cliff and wanted to stop halfway down. You can't really have it that way. And for me, that was just really, I think, the one thing the book really told me is just how futile really any kind of well, at least the modern conservative movement really is.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of. So, do you know the distinction between the old Hegelians and the young Hegelians?
No.
Oh, go ahead.
If I recall correctly, the old Hegelians are kind of very much in favor of the Prussian state, kind of old-style 19th century authoritarians, monarchists, whereas the young Hegelians were largely materialists. Sort of, well, Marx was a young Hegelian, so was Ludwig Feuerbach, I think his name was.
Yeah.
What's Stirner? That's his name.
Yeah, Max Stirner.
Yeah, people like that who kind of went a bit more of an egoistic, individualistic, kind of materialistic kind of direction with it.
Yeah, but if I'm not mistaken, so Hegel, he wrote about, in the phenomenology of spirit and stuff like that, about, how there's the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age. And the old Hegelians, they kind of believed that there was this sense of progress, but now is the time that it's all good. It's the peak right now, and that we need to preserve what it is right now. And the young Hegelians, however, they believed that, hey, we're continuing on this progress, but the progress has yet to come. And so inevitably, obviously in our timeline, the young Hegelians won, but I don't think this old Hegelian notion that, oh, it's great right now, let's stop it. If you accept progress, it must continue. If you set progress as your ultimate goal, you're always going to be looking for something to progress on.
Well, you think that the old Hegelian philosophy doesn't seem particularly sustainable to me, if you don't mind me saying.
Yeah, no, I don't believe it is.
I mean, take a military dictatorship that was absolutely ill-suited for the Industrial Revolution and preserve that ever onward. I don't know, maybe, right?
Well, that's kind of my critique, is that, the old Hegelians are like the conservatives of today.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood you. Yes. Yeah. I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think Moldbug's criticism of conservatives is extremely useful and strong, because it's very weird how much solidarity you see among a lot of conservatives as if they're actually conserving anything. People sort of have this illusion of society being like this pendulum where it swings back and forth, and that can be true in some like small windows of time. But if you look at it holistically over the last few hundred years, there's really only one direction to things. This whole idea of things swinging one way and the other isn't really true.
Yeah. Yes, and I would argue that that really is a damning. It's really a damning blow for the idea of conservatism in the modern sense, because it really just paints it as a futile stance. If anyone would like to add to that.
Well, there's also a great refutation of this, is just like list things that conservatives have conserved. And if you can't list a significant number of them, then it basically proves Moldbug's point. That's one of the great things too. It's a falsifiable premise.
Well, we also have sort of, in this particular instance, we have the question about, pardon me. We also have this very unique historical situation where it appears that we might have no conservative force in the culture, period.
Yes, and one thing that you can observe is
really seen, right?
Yeah.
Pardon me. Yeah,
yes. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to restate, this is sort of, it's not just that the conservative movement has failed, it's that the conservative movement is basically it's getting wiped off the board. And progressives are talking about wiping the conservative movement off the board, right? they're talking about how they just want we should just do what they did to the conservatives in California, just remove them as a political force whatsoever.
That's kind of interesting because Moldbug sort of comments on this. Like the best thing that the Republican Party could do to defeat the Democrats would be to dissolve itself, because it would expose the reality of a one-party state.
And that is something I would highly recommend. The destruction of the Republican Party. Just have the outer party of the Democrats and the inner party Democrats. Like that's the reality we have in this country. There is only one party in the Democratic Party.
So do you think, in a sense, that this termination of the conservative movement can be a positive by potentially exposing the reality to more people?
The termination of the Republican Party certainly would be. The termination of the conservative movement, probably not. Because, I mean, we need networks. We need cultural spaces. We need areas to train young people. What we don't need is the illusion of a political disagreement that is not actually a reality in the culture. You know, and it actively impedes our ability to do the essential basic organizing that is the next step.
Yeah, and I think one thing you can really observe is how the conservative movement has seemed to make compromises, but the things they give away they can't get back. But the things that they get out of these compromises, the progressives just take those the second they can. Yes.
You know, something interesting I've noticed too is among progressives, like, people even recognize the whole concept of a uniparty, but they tend to view it as more of just the corporate establishment and not simply that it's all leftists. I used to be a progressive, so I guess I'm one of those open-minded progressives, but I thought that way myself, and it's kind of it's weird that people don't see through that, but I guess everyone has their blinders on.
Can you say that again? See through what?
Well, like I notice a lot of people on the left, they recognize this concept of a uniparty, but not in the sense that reactionaries.
What do you mean a uniparty?
Like there's only one party, like we just discussed. Like there is no, but they see it as
that's them being honest, right?
But they frame it. They always frame it differently. They frame it as like the corporate establishment or something like that.
Yeah, that the Republicans and the Democrats are simply the manifestation of the corporate interests.
Right. Whereas what Distributist just said,
you mean like the far. You mean like the far left notion, like the Ralph Nader notion that they're all just two heads of the same.
Right. Exactly. But they have a different framing of what the same thing is, where, like you just said, they're all Democrats, right? But people can't seem to see through that for some reason.
Well, I mean, you know, if we were ever in conversation, this is another thing too, what's so strange about this entire essay or book or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's presumably written to a progressive audience, but no progressive would get past the first chapter. And a lot of these statements also depends on us sort of talking to progressives when, you know, it's very difficult to do this. I mean, you know, if you could get people on the Ralph Nader side, and this is why I think progressives are sort of a more promising avenue in a lot of regards than are, you know, apathetic people, apathetic moderates, or even normie conservatives, is that, you know, I would take a Democrat who wanted to disestablish the Democratic Party, you know, I would disestablish the Republican Party, because I think the Republican Party actively hurts the kind of future that I want to see. And the Democratic Party actively hurts it even more. It sounds like a win-win for me.
Yeah. But one thing I will say in the kind of the interpretation from the left, I guess leftists would be that the Democrats and the Republicans are kind of both the party of the corporations. It does kind of fit in with the idea of the Cathedral, because I'd say that they both see, because the corporate interests seem to be along the lines of progressivism. So I kind of see how those two narratives would kind of fit together.
Well, the progressives are right in their analysis, but it's not complete. It doesn't contain the part where not only are they one party, but they're a progressive party. That's the key observation.
Yes.
I mean, the Democratic Party has actually delivered victories to the progressive movement, which is not true for the Republican Party. The Republican Party has delivered. I mean, like, we're just looking at, you know, can I tell you guys a story?
Sure.
Does anyone know The Federalist?
The Federalist?
Yes. The Federalist, the online magazine that people Molly Ziegler having. I know I used to be more of a normie conservative, more of a Republican, and I like these guys. They write good articles, and I listen to their podcast. And the most recent podcast they had, I think it was this Monday, was a pro-life lobbyist talking to Ben Dominish, who's the host of the Federalist Radio Hour, about progress in Congress. And sort of strangely enough, and this is a good thing about the Federalist Radio Hour, Ben just nails this lobbyist. She's all like, "Oh, we're doing great work to get our pro-life people heard," and he's like, "No, you've betrayed us. Like, is Planned Parenthood defunded?" And she's like, "Well, we just can't get the 60 votes." He's like, "The voters haven't given us enough power." And Ben's like, "Look, we've given you a Congress that's Republican. We've given you a president that's Republican, and you can't defund Planned Parenthood." And she's just like, "Well, it's just not the right time." And he really lets her have it, right? And I almost felt sorry for the woman. And I'm like, "Oh wow, well, give it to him." And then they cut to commercial breaks, and their podcast server, Podcast One, comes on, which is their sponsor, and it advertises their best-selling podcast, which is Time with Barbara Boxer. And then they go back to grilling the pro-life activist. So interrupting for a commercial break on this podcast where we hold the Republicans' feet to the fire is a commercial for Barbara Boxer's political commentary. That's the platform that they're running on.
And I think that
this illustrates what we're talking about here, right? The thing is that the pro-life movement. I'm sorry, I wasn't quite finished, Endeavor. If you hope you don't.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
The pro-life movement and a lot of boomer conservatives in particular think that it's a great achievement that they're not fired for being pro-life. But like they would be if they were anti-gay marriage in a lot of instances. But this is not actually a victory. And if you look at any of the supposed victories that the pro-life movement has had, you'll see them. Like you'll see them operating on top of hardware platforms that are fundamentally progressive and that sustain the exact opposite. I mean, it's essentially the pro-life movement is not dying, but in many ways it's preserved in aspect. Right? It's not going anywhere. There's no avenue to get abortion legalized. There isn't even any avenue to get a Planned Parenthood defunded. So I mean, and if the case right now is Planned Parenthood is not going to get defunded if the political reality we have right now isn't massively shifted, which all evidence is to the contrary, that we're probably going to take a left swing in the next election. So that's off the table. In the meantime, the national conversation is to literally go after politicians for $1,000 or $2,000 donations from a not governmentally funded lobby group, National Rifle Association, because the NRA's conflict of interest with a product that it doesn't sell, unlike Planned Parenthood. This is the thing. I mean, this apparatus we have is useless. It's an exhibition. It's nothing.
Yeah, and I'd like to make an addendum actually, because we've had something quite similar in the UK with that. I think it was 3 or 4 days ago, one of the largest counties in my country, I think it was Essex, actually made protesting outside of abortion centres illegal because it was shaming women. And this is basically what you're seeing in the United States, but about 30 years ahead. Now, the Conservative Party in our country is supposed to represent all conservative interests, be they corporatist kind of neoliberals or the kind of Rees-Mogg traditional conservative types like us. Now, if a conservative government in a predominantly conservative county is banning protesting outside of abortion centres, it seems pretty clear which way at least the Conservatives are going. But in the UK, if you talk to anybody who is actually conservative in a real sense, like our kind of a conservative, they'd have known this for years anyway.
Yeah, they actually did the same thing in where I live. They banned protesting outside of abortion clinics. But one thing I think that is a good point that was brought up is that the one real failing of the conservative movement is not understanding the cathedral, because they seem to have this idea that, well, we just need enough votes to defund Planned Parenthood. We just need enough votes to do this one, pass through this legislation. Mm-hmm. But they don't seem to realize that really that the direction that the cathedral is pushing civilization, like the society, you're just not going to be able to do these. And the second that you don't have those votes anymore, it'll be overturned.
Right. Even if they get it passed through, the cathedral is just going to undo it the next chance it gets, which it inevitably will get.
Unfunding Planned Parenthood might be an exception. That would put a big road bump on the progressive movement. But that was just more or less to illustrate the ineffectiveness that the Republican Party had even accomplished in achievable ends. They certainly aren't going to ban abortion because that would be undone at the next possible opportunity.
And on this abortion topic, I notice Republicans and conservatives doing this thing that they do a lot, where they sort of take like a righteous stand against a losing cause, and there's like some like honor in that, but that's useless if you actually want to preserve some way of life. It's not enough to just like die on a hill for the sake of dying on it. You actually have to come up with a policy or a plan that is actually going to reverse this. And, at this point, people are arguing about when is it okay to have an abortion, not whether or not it should even be legal for the most part, I find. Certain people, of course, are.
Yeah. And I'd say that a lot of these are really bad tactics. Like, I'd say that that they really made a mistake with the wedding cake controversy, because like it really looked bad on them. I think. I mean, even though I agree with I agree with the bakers, but for the conservative movement, it made them look ridiculous, in my opinion.
Yeah, but the thing is this sort of feeds into the notion that the progressive movement is largely an unconscious force. That we're essentially not fighting against a plan; we're fighting against a
force of nature.
Yeah, we're an entropic force, right?
Yeah. I think that really is what the cathedral is.
That ties into what you said, Endeavor, because that's the observation that the conservatives will not make. It's not simply people or Democrats that they're fighting. It's this entropic force. It's a decentralized collection of entities. It's not merely some plan against them.
Yeah.
This is essentially why traditionalists should not be interested in politics. They should only be interested in it as identity politics, as single issue voters, and as essentially putting up boundaries and barriers against incursions, and then striking back with an incredible amount of force with a very, very little warning, which is how communities should defend themselves.
Mm-hmm. So I think this segues well into what I wanted to talk about next, and that is how to fight the cathedral. So, go ahead, Intermezzo.
Oh no, go ahead.
In the book, what Moldbug had said was that essentially what he said was that democracy would have to vote itself out of existence, actually, and that you would need to get rid of the cathedral's influence somehow. And I mean, he even said like he doesn't know if you will ever be able to do that. There's two strategies that I've been looking into. One of them is trying to infiltrate kind of these institutions. The other one would be trying to discredit them. Do any of you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Moldbug mentions the first thing you brought up there about infiltrating them. And it seems to me, and I would agree with him in this respect, that the cathedral's actually happy to have you there. As he puts it, I think this might actually be a quote, is it's better to have you pissing inside the tent out than for you to be like throwing rocks from the outside, basically. They're perfectly the cathedral loves when the conservatives join their ranks, because then they could just monitor them and be totally aware of the enemy's behavior. So I don't really think, also that's more in line with the subversive tactics that they use to get where they are in the first place, and they're going to recognize those tactics being used against them. I don't think that's the way to go about it. I think if you look at history, sorry, go ahead. Okay,
the reactionary expat says something similar. The progressives remember themselves doing this. They're not about to let anyone else do the same thing to them.
And if you look at more or less successful right-wing movements in history, they tend to be more of an all-at-once approach, a complete takeover. I guess a good example of this is the fascists in Nazi Germany. Like, if I've actually been reading Schreier's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and what I think there's actually a lot of good lessons to be learned from the Nazi Party, as crazy as that might sound, because like the way they organized themselves was ingenious. They organized basically as a governing entity and simply shifted right into place and immediately started governing in full. And I think that's sort of the approach that Moldbug takes, with his whole corporate setup. I forget exactly the terms he uses, but I think that's the approach that has to happen, and not the subversive approach.
Yeah. So I was thinking about potentially making because I think a lot of these institutions are actually obsolete. And I think that they might be able to be knocked down. So, for example, I don't think college is really that necessary for a good chunk of the population. I think that we could just simply have online certification tests now that the internet is put in place. Not for every single profession, obviously, but for a good chunk of them. And I think that you could market this as, oh, this is going to save you money because of student loans. And I don't think I think that would probably be maybe a somewhat easy sell if you are a politician or something like that. Also, like a lot of these online, like these big news corporations are kind of, they're starting to lose viewership. And so perhaps instead of really trying to subvert these institutions or discredit them, maybe just trying to go around them and seeing them as kind of obsolete entities might be
The problem with that is, though, that the people that like society as a whole does not see them as obsolete. They take the university's word for it.
Yeah, and that's my solution. That's where my solution comes in, because I fully agree with this. I think I'd go one step further, though. I think it's necessary to start working inside of a parallel society, and then waiting for a moment of disorder and discord within our societies, which is actually relatively close, as I'm sure all of you probably agree with me. And then in that case, just going head on and whacking them out of the way.
Parallelism is the way to go.
Yeah, and Moldbug says that as well. He suggests actually basically forming your own parallel society and actually like holding votes and stuff and verifying these people as voters, and then basically going to the government and being like, we have the majority here, hand over the reins. And that's it.
It's kind of already happening now a lot. Like, we're already starting to see the formation of independent internet businesses for these sorts of minority groups, like the alt-right groups like that. And we're starting to see sort of more decentralized education, Khan Academy and things like that. Just the democratization of information in general. So I think it's a relatively easy thing to achieve, and I can see it coming about in the very, very near future.
Maybe, I don't know. I have a more skeptical outlook, I guess. It's hard for me to imagine getting a group together sizable enough to simply basically walk up to any Western government and just demand the reins from them, even if you have a majority. It's hard for me to see how the people in power would just relinquish that.
Well, I mean, it's been done in the past. Mussolini did it. Ion Antonescu did it in Romania. It's happened before.
That is true, but those haven't worked out very well.
I mean, what are you really looking for? Are you looking for? I mean, I think what we're looking for right now is a modicum of breathing room. We're not looking to take over form a militaristic coup, or maybe people are, but
No,
not at all.
I mean,
Moldbug is against that, and I think all of us are.
It's a pointless endeavor, and I think that analogies to fascist movements are pretty facile. A, they were unsuccessful. B, they were operating in a society that's nothing like ours, and that in some ways can't be anything like ours. And need I mention optics? I think that if you're looking for some kind of parallelism, you need to start looking at things like leftist countercultures. Now, I know I've said very much you can't do necessarily everything the left does, because there's no symmetry between us and the left. But insofar as creating countercultures, and I'm thinking of things like punk, I'm thinking of things like open source software community, I'm thinking of things like hippie communes, intentional communities. Those are not implicitly left-wing ideas. They're implicitly separatist and anti-authoritarian ones.
I think you're right. We shouldn't emulate fascists, but I think there are certain lessons to be learned from what they did to come to power. Just like there are for the left.
But which ones? I think there are vanishingly few lessons you can learn from.
Well, the one I brought up earlier in how the way the National Socialists actually organize themselves is as a government. Like, they had ministers analogous to roles that would actually be filled in government. So when the time came to actually take over, they had all the people necessary to fill those slots. And I think if we ever want to get to a point where we can simply move in, we need to have that prepared already. So,
but that's when you have a political party or something, right?
Yeah, we're not nearly at that point yet. But if that point can be reached, I think that is a useful lesson that can be learned from those fascist movements.
I'm just not even so sure that we're in the era of political parties.
Yeah, I don't think organizing as a political party is a good idea, especially not right now.
Yeah, that's why I pointed specifically to Ion Antonescu and Corneliu Codreanu, because they formed mostly what was a social movement in the form of the Legion of the Archangel Michael. And I think we can learn a lot more from them than we can from, say, leftist movements, because I think what Dave is potentially overlooking is that a lot of these people are just pushing in the direction of the general culture in the first place, just slightly more ahead. Whereas I would argue that the Legion of the Archangel Michael was definitely pushing in the opposite direction, even though you would be correct in saying that these societies are very, very different from what we have now.
Yeah, and I think at some point though, we do need some group of people would have to take over the reins. So whether you want to call it a political party, I definitely don't think we should have a democratic political party or anything like that.
But this is I'm going to quote Mencius Moldbug on you. He says that the reactionary does not have such specific political agendas because we're so far away from their reigns of power. It's kind of ridiculous to talk about. It's like saying who's going to be Duke of New Jersey when we take power.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you. I'm just saying,
designate you Duke. It's a ridiculous question. If you're as radically opposed to the form of society we have now as most people here seem to be, designing these political associations is sort of it's closer to LARPing than it actually is to planning anything, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm just saying, we shouldn't dismiss potential lessons from even the fascists that could be useful in the future. They're not.
No, I'm not dismissing them because they're fascist. I just don't think I've ever heard one that's been particularly useful to me, because they rely on structures that are unavailable to us, or are highly ineffective in the kind of society that we have right now.
Yeah. So another idea that I'll float is the idea of kind of discrediting the cathedral in some ways, like trying to get people to lose faith in their word. So, kind of like, you kind of see this happening with the mainstream media, with social media kind of taking over that reign, which, I mean, I guess you could say it's a good sign, but I seem to think that there's an area to exploit them if they can be discredited. If people can see, if people can get to the point where the cathedral's word is not as powerful, that weakens its grip.
Well, the cathedral doesn't have a word. It has a bunch of people who have. I mean, you mean like every single person in the mainstream, like.
Mm-hmm. I think it's
when you say the cathedral's word, right?
Well, I mean, okay,
so every single political and cultural leader that's mainstream. Well,
I don't mean it to that extent. But what I mean is if somehow just making people less more skeptical of the institutions really that are around.
I think you're on the right track with this, and this is an anecdote, but it's what started red pilling me, and particularly it was the idea of Islam. And I found personally that once a stronghold was poked through one of these progressive ideas, my natural skepticism opened up, and it began the process of me simply taking all of them apart, basically. So I don't know if that would work on most people or a small amount of people, but there seems to be some value in discrediting specific ideas, and that could trigger people then using their own minds to question other ones without you necessarily having to discredit everything across the board.
Okay. So would anyone else like to reply to that?
Well, I mean, essentially, in the sense that you mean endeavor, I think this is just a synonym for red pilling, right?
Yeah. I think that what I was trying to get is I guess just red pill a lot of people, which I do think that's important. But I think what you had said before was that movements have to be top down, not bottom up.
I don't think this red pilling thing is a good idea. I don't think more than about 20% of the population can ever really be meaningfully red pilled.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's true, but that actually segues into the second thing I said, is that you're right. No more than 20% of the population can be red pilled because 80% of the population doesn't fucking care. But the corollary to this is that most movements are not. Despite what they say about it, the institutions are in some sense organically ground up to a certain extent, but the leadership is top down. The leadership is that of the 20%. So, you're looking to do is you're looking to red pill individuals who are effective and who can get things done. And this is the difficulty. It's really easy to red pill a bunch of people who are ineffectual or have psychological problems, but it's ultimately meaningless, right? They can't influence anybody. They actively hurt the optics of your movement. Despite the fact that they think that by criticizing things that happened in the past, they're doing something. What you really want is you want networking. You want people to create things culturally. You want people to organize and build friendships and facilitate the production of cultural capital. That's all work done by the top 20% of the people in society. And so, really, the question of red pilling, it's not a question about red pilling more people. It's about red pilling the right people.
Yeah, I agree with that. So what is a good strategy for red pilling the right people, more specifically, I guess?
Are you asking me?
Anyone?
I think just poking holes in a couple, don't be overtly reactionary when talking with people, but just kind of poking holes in different liberal things as they come up. So, for example, you can go bring up the fact that immigration traditionally actually hurts the poor more than any other segment of society. And so for a person with liberal leanings, the reason why a lot of people, in my opinion, are liberal is for empathetic reasons. They want to help people. And so they kind of view, I want to go help the immigrants because, they need help. But if you go make it something, if you kind of bring them to realize that, immigrants, they really hurt the poor people of our society. So you really need to choose between the immigrant or the poor people of our society, and you need to really make that choice explicit. That kind of makes them kind of doubt their position a bit. And it kind of makes them understand maybe a right-wing position a bit. And I think if you get a critical number of these kind of these inconsistencies within liberal positions, I think that might be a way to kind of guide somebody towards more reactionary lines of thinking.
So since we're looking for a small subset of people who are going to be useful, it seems like the better strategy would be to cast a wide net in hopes of hitting those people. It's definitely useful to try and red pill people in personal circumstances, and I do that myself, but then you're limiting yourself to a very small group of people.
I don't think there's any real, if we're going to try and red pill people at the top of society, I don't think that will really work, because I think that the morality of the people at the very top of the society is simply incompatible with what we want to achieve.
No, Martian, I didn't say people at the very top of society. I said the 20% of the people who are effective, self-motivated actors.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean.
I don't think those people are the ones that are on the very top of society. Although it's not the majority, the top 20% is certainly not the elite of the elite. It's a significant part of the population.
Well, you know what I mean. You know what I mean.
I think you're conflating. I know what you mean, but I don't think it's what I meant, which is why I'm trying to disaggregate the two terms, right?
Okay.
When you think of society, top people in society, you mean the people who are really, really wealthy and they're super invested and they're really old and.
Oh, I don't actually. I mean more the people who have the cultural swing, the people who are going to actually be projecting those people.
So give me an example of a person like that.
Okay, so if we think of the first triumvirate, for example, say Crassus wasn't making.
No. In this society, not in some society that existed 2,000 years ago that was based on slaves. Like in this society, like what's the picture of a person in this elite that you think is unreachable? Because I'm thinking about like upper middle class person, works at a programming job, has a college education, is like, listens to the Daily Show, that kind of person, right?
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. I don't think these upper middle class people are really compatible with our morality in the first place.
Yeah, I actually agree.
But is that the person I just mentioned? Is that upper class?
I'd consider that upper middle class. I'd say that's in the top 20%.
I mean, the thing is,
but that person better be reachable, otherwise you've got zero chance.
Distributist is literally describing me basically right now. Like he said, guy with a programming job, middle class to upper middle class. Like I fit the category he just described, and I've been reached by these ideas.
So do I. But I associate with a large number of these people, and I don't think there's ever going to be any sort of opportunity to convert them to our morality, let alone reach them with our ideas.
Okay. So these people are reachable, or there's zero hope for any kind of cultural movement, let alone a political party.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I don't think there's much of a chance. I think we have to wait for events to come into play. And
even if you're waiting, who are you waiting with? So you're saying that there's zero. The problem, Martian, is it seems like you're saying there's zero chance of converting people who are like you and me.
Yeah, that's what's confusing me.
Yeah, but the thing is,
you could say there's a limited chance, but zero, definitely not.
Okay, maybe like 10%. But what I'm saying is that the kind of morality that we want to tap into as reactionaries is an extremely rare one, even amongst normie conservatives. We're talking about a puny amount of people which aren't really going to do anything. I mean,
so the options are do nothing or red pill people. But you're saying that, well, I'm certainly not everyone's going to be red pilled. You're not going to red pill 20% of society en masse, at least from our current understanding. But that's not what I'm asking for. I'm saying we have a certain number of people who are self-motivated self-starters.
Yeah, and how many of us are
less than a fraction of a percent.
Yeah, I'm talking.
You could fail 99 out of 100 times to convert those 20% of people in society, and quadruple the size of the reactionary movement, even in that 99% failure.
Yeah, and even then, we're still going to achieve basically nothing. So,
well, no, a movement that's the size it is right now, and a movement that's 4 times the size it is right now.
Okay, so
are very different animals.
So what we're talking right now, we're talking maybe 10,000 people in our specific neck of the woods right now. We times that by 4, that's 40,000. What is that going to do?
Well, it's still better. It's still better than nothing.
It does a lot. It does a lot for just the stuff we're trying to do here. Yeah. But still, I don't even think that it's as limited as you say. I don't think the failure rate's 99%. I think the failure rate's like 70 for this 20%.
Like 70%? No, I reckon it's more like 95 at best.
Well, one thing is though, we have to understand though that if we're talking that influential 20%, even if you can only get a couple thousand, like that's still pretty sizable. And if they actually
and I think we're talking about the upper middle class. And one thing that you have to understand about the upper middle class is they're really kind of a population of people who are obsessed with self-image and with career advancement. And so if they see a growing movement, they're going to be more likely to join than one that is completely stationary and not growing.
Yeah, but we're talking about at least my own prediction, right? You can differ on this. Like at most, we're talking at least for my own prediction, say 40,000 people across the Western world. Now that's puny in every single country.
Wait, how many people?
But you're talking about. So is this saying that you're saying that a quadrupling? So. Either you care about a movement that's reactionary or you don't. If you don't, I'm not so sure why the question's even interesting. But if you do, you're saying that quadrupling a movement's size with people who are self-starters and are activists is not going to make a difference. I don't see how that, but somehow the original size of the movement is going to make a difference.
I think every tree comes from a seed, man.
I don't understand how those two statements can even be held in line, right? Like you couldn't possibly think that the 10,000 strong reactionary movement is important, but the 50,000 or 60,000 size reactionary movement is ultimately meaningless. I don't understand how that could be.
So I also have a question. Maybe this is will be helpful in making people understand or helping people understand each other. So Mauritian, are you talking mostly college-age students?
I'm talking of my own ilk that I'm aware of, right?
Yeah. Because maybe it's easy. So, like, I know for myself in particular, like, I'm starting to enter the working world, and people tend to have more of a right-leaning bias later on once they actually have a job and once they're actually responsible. And so maybe in college it might be a lot more difficult as opposed to later on, maybe like in Distributist age or my age, or
Yeah, but I still don't think that we're going
and
to be.
perhaps we're also in the United States, which is a little bit different than Britain.
I'd like to reassert my question to Mauritian, though.
Yeah,
Because I don't see how you can think that if reactionary politics or reactionary networking is useless, then why are we even having this conversation? If it is useful, increasing the size, admittedly, we've already determined that we're increasing the size from the population of people who are self-started and motivated. How could that not be useful?
Well, a number of ways, actually. First of all, if we keep the numbers small, then we keep the ideas that we want to carry forward relatively well concentrated. If we import 4 times the amount of people, then we're going to have a resolution loss on the ideas that we want to retain.
But how do you get those ideas out, though?
If you're talking about a specific organization, perhaps we're talking about a general political persuasion, right?
But I think that still, if you were to increase the number that much, you would see warping in the base presuppositions.
I mean, right now the
Moldbug
movement is so small we can't even get you couldn't even get 100 people to meet in a major metropolitan area like Seattle.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
You're talking about a movement that's so small that you can't even fill a classroom, and we're worried about it being so large that you couldn't have cohesion. I'm not so sure even what to say about that.
Well, I think we're thinking in a much different way, because I think that when the change is going to come about, like, there will be major changes over the next 10, 20, 30 years, but I think at least I'm thinking from a Spengler's perspective, right? Where we're in this sort of transition period between autumn and winters, if you know what I'm talking about. I think that it will take a lot of how do I put it into words? I think there needs to be a preservation of what we believe, and I think it's going to be quite a long time before that can actually go into force, even if we do increase the size of the movement. I think increasing the size of the movement, regardless of how small it is, I think it will dilute what we need. And when there is actually a situation when we can spread this properly, then we'll need like a relatively pure virgin as is.
I think it's purity spiraling. I think
time isn't really on our side here either.
I think that if we had like some remarkable world-shaping people in the movement right now, and they were just like they were doing all sorts of stuff, they were writing books, they were creating organizations, then maybe we could say, okay, well, you're going to dilute this really lean organization you have. But right now we really don't. We have a bunch of people who kind of are part-timers, and at this moment we're just a seed, right? We need more chances to get people who will be big hits, big creators, big people with even right now what we have is we just have an opposition to something, right? We don't even have really a really good positive idea that needs to have its purity preserved.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not even really necessary to do that. I mean, of course, create culture because you need that in a small community, but I think it's basically enough to just retain the ideas at this point.
What ideas?
Well, the ideas that we're discussing in this stream.
Well, Moldbug's idea is just opposition to the cathedral, and what comes after it doesn't even matter quite so much. He comments on this in the letter that in order to avoid this destruction of the core ideas is to just have a really simple core idea of we oppose the cathedral, we're going to take it down. That's it. We're not going to argue about specifics of what comes after or reforming it or something like that.
No,
what I will have to say though, I do disagree with what you're saying, Mauritian, because I feel that getting the word out to more and more people, that is what's going to need to happen. And at this moment, there's not that many people, that many reactionaries out there really pushing for anything. And I will say that a movement doesn't there doesn't have to be 40,000 people writing books, making making videos.
Well, that seems to be what Dave is arguing here, because we're talking
Well,
about...
No, I'm saying every person you have in a movement is a chance that you get a truly profound creator.
Yeah, but we're talking specifically about influencing that top 20%.
Well,
here.
okay, they can be supporters of it without
Yeah.
being thought leaders.
Exactly. They have money, right? This is another thing you need too. You need people to fund these things, right? And right now, even if you were a brilliant reactionary creator, there isn't anyone writing you checks.
Yeah, because I mean, even if say you get these ideas out to I don't know, some guy that works in media or something like that. I don't know, but he doesn't have to be a reactionary thought leader, but just the fact that you have his support, that gets you places.
The problem is
you can branch out.
The problem is that 10 minutes ago we were talking about self-motivated activist types, and now we're going on about financial funders. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Well,
what do you mean? It's part of a package deal. You either have an association that puts funders in contact with ideas people, or you don't. I mean,
yeah, but that's not what we started. That's not the presupposition we started this particular sub debate on. We started it on getting full-time or kind of part-time activists like ourselves involved in this.
no, we're talking about anyone associated with us. I didn't think. I thought we said just who do we red pill, right? Red pill doesn't mean you immediately become an activist. It just means you become sympathetic to the ideas.
Okay, so we went from who do we red pill? We red pill the top 20% of self-motivated, kind of like the people who are prone to be true believer activist types. And
no, I didn't say who are prone to be activists. I said they're self-motivated self-starters.
Yeah, which in those terms implies a level of activism might not be on the same level as us.
Okay, well, whatever. Even if they were activists, I wouldn't be like broken up. I mean, there's a variety of roles that needs to be filled, right?
Yeah, but I'm just saying that that's what I got from that statement.
Okay.
I got from that statement that you were implying.
So, to kind of focus this conversation a bit more, we seem to this consensus seems to be that the way to oppose the cathedral would be to kind of form a parallel movement. Would that be correct?
That's true. Parallelism is the only opportunity that I see that we have.
I can agree on that.
The thing is, I don't think we have enough people to make any parallel thing meaningful. I couldn't create a reactionaries organization in Seattle. I don't think there's enough people to do that yet.
Yeah. And I think one thing we should discuss though is like
certainly not people to fund it, right? That's another problem.
and it's not just that you need more people. The reason you want more people is to find more really useful people.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's an 80-20 rule, right? You want more people so that you have more chances to get highly motivated individuals. And of those highly motivated individuals that you're trying to get, who are the top 20%, you are looking for those big fish who are either brilliant artistic geniuses or big pocket funders, either of which could be revolutionary for people like us.
Okay, I'm glad that we got that distinction down, but I think the only disagreement we really have here is over the timing. I think you guys are suggesting we do it now. I'm suggesting that I think it's necessary to do it later on, closer to this sort of event where we can actually.
Well, wouldn't you rather have that? Wouldn't you rather have it now for when that event comes? Because we can't tell when it's coming.
I mean, I'm more suggesting we do it yesterday. Like things seem like they're in pretty dire straits. I don't see us having much time to wait.
Perhaps in America, but in this country, I can be thrown in prison for 6 years for carrying around a fucking butter knife, right?
Isn't that more reason to start acting now?
Well, that's the problem.
I'm not telling you to carry around knives, but like.
No, I know, but the thing is that I know that this legal situation is not sustainable, so I might as well wait until.
Mauritian, can I say, wouldn't you rather have that branched out before that happens? Because I mean, won't you have a harder time getting people? Or well, if you've got people before that, wouldn't they have a much stronger base for when that time comes?
Yeah,
but we're talking about ideas that are literally illegal here. I might as well wait until the police force is weak enough that I can actually get this stuff working, right?
So to be fair to Mauritian and not to gang up on him, I get what you're saying. We have very little power, and you want to wait until our pieces on the chessboard are in the most opportune position before striking. But I think the rest of us kind of think that we don't have the time to wait for that opportunity.
Well, yeah, I think that's where we disagree, because I think that
Okay.
Well, I think that. Oh, sorry.
How much time do you think it would take to get us into a position where we could make some sort of strike and try to? At what point do you want to increase our size? I guess, like in years.
Well, I mean, that would vary by country. I mean, in America, you're probably in a good place right now. You're more unstable than we are. But in Britain, I don't know, a couple of decades?
I'm of the opinion.
I think you're growing or dying.
I think I'm of the opinion that time's of the essence, and if you can, the sooner the better for, I think, any reactionary movement.
Oh, any movement generally, if it's not growing, it's dying. This is always the problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think one thing we should discuss also would be what would we be looking to get out of this? So, like, kind of what would our goals be? And I think generally what I would say is the goal would be to create a more sustainable, more healthy, and kind of more powerful society that I guess is resilient to the just natural decay of society that Moldbug prescribed.
well, I mean,
I would say that the goals depend very much on the nation too. Like the Stuart Restoration type thing that he talks about is very Britain specific. Be able to institute a Stuart Restoration over the entire former British Empire, right? So I think the goals sort of depend by country.
I don't think a Stuart. I think with the whole Stuart Restoration thing, that's more of just a kind of a Sulla period of delay more than anything. So I think we're talking about something far more in the line of someone like I mentioned many times before, Spengler and maybe even Evola. I think we have to think from a position of just reducing the high culture to nothing and then starting from scratch.
yeah, Spengler thought that. I mean, I think I might be more in agreement with you here, Mershon. I think the point is to hit the reset button and to get sort of a new culture that carries forward the seed of the old one. Not to essentially superimpose an overstructure on this particularly unstable.
Yeah, to use Spengler's language, there's two specific civilizations or high cultures that I'm going to mention. There's Faustian, which is the one we're currently in, and classical, which is like Roman Greece. Now, the way I'd see it is that this future civilization would take the seed of the Faustian civilization as Faust took it from the classical civilizations. Or at least I think that would be the most sustainable and most successful way of really looking at our future.
Do you mind describing what that would kind of look like?
So it would be basically writing down as much of literature, as much sort of, maybe not necessarily science and technology. Technology especially is a bad idea. Perhaps the more basic science, literature, philosophies and stuff, like keeping that in a safe place. And then when this new nation, well, when this new civilization even, or culture begins to sprout, it takes that information and allows that to influence its growth in a similar way to how the medieval era took on a lot of the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers and allowed them to grow and, of course, modify the expression of Faustian culture.
Yeah. That is an interesting. That is interesting because I do. What we do kind of seem to be seeing is, all that's kind of wearing away. And if there was going to be a restoration, you would need someone to kind of preserve something to restore. What I'm trying to get at is like, what would we be replacing the cathedral with? So like, what would our end goal be? That's kind of what I'm trying to.
Yeah,
trying to get at.
All these solutions kind of sound like. Have any of you read the Foundation series?
Yes.
Yeah, Harry Seldon.
Yeah, it really sounds like a Seldon plan type thing.
Yeah, this is an idea Avila has as well. He's come up a few times now. The idea of standing among the ruins, being pillars of tradition in the ruins of civilization. seems to be a common idea among reactionary thought. That's important, but on an individual level. But there does have to be some sort of positive vision for the future. I haven't read much on Moldbug's neo-camperalism. It's an interesting idea. What do you guys think of that idea as an alternative system to enact this restoration?
I don't know enough about that.
I'm not aware of it.
So
It's
neo-camperalism is like it's basically converting the government into a corporate model. Essentially, part of the purpose is to basically buy out all the hidden influence. So you basically print money and pay off all of the debt. The money actually becomes shares in the government, and you buy out all of the corporate influence from lobbyists and such. So you basically pay off all of the hidden influence of the cathedral, and then you just have a straightforward system of everyone. It's pseudo-democratic in the sense that everyone who is a shareholder has some ownership of the government as a corporation, but it's not egalitarian. It's a really weird idea.
Okay. So this is the corporatist kind of autocracy that Moldbug had hinted at the end of the open letter, correct?
Yeah, not quite autocracy, only autocratic in the sense that there's like a transition period, and then the same way that a corporation isn't autocratic when you have a board of, because the CEO serves at the behest of the board, and the board is composed of the top shareholders and things like that.
Yeah. What I would say is, I mean, my main criticism of the book would be that I really feel that the remedy, like what the ways Western societies really need, is they need a something to justify themselves. So what they really need is a culture, a tradition, and just a way of life that can be passed on, and really because this is really what the cathedral's eating away at. And I think that an assertion of that is going to be required for kind of any reactionary movement. As to how we're going to do that, I guess that the model is one you could look at, but it's difficult to say though.
It's very future looking too, because that assumes the destruction of the cathedral in the first place, which is the more pressing concern. But I do think you need a positive vision for the future. It's not enough to merely oppose the cathedral.
I'm not so sure, though, that by positive vision that will inspire artists and poet, a corporatization of the government is really... I think it's a cool thought experiment, and I kind of chuckled to myself when I read it, but insofar as something that you want to put in any kind of communication, it's just I'll keep this firmly in the crackpot folder.
Yeah, because what I wanted to say was that you couldn't really make any good artwork suggesting that if we're going to corporatize the government, because I think the real reason I got into this was really just my love for Western civilization, my culture, and just and Christianity, of course. And I really feel that that's kind of what's going to need to be at the root of any reactionary movement, is going to be a love for something bigger.
Yeah, and I think the positive vision, I don't support Moldbug's neo-camberalism, and I think it's much more important to have the individual respect for tradition as your positive vision for what the future will be, as opposed to some political system. Because that's really sort of the point of the reactionary movement, is to cease the destruction of tradition, not to just have a more different government, basically.
Yeah,
I find this whole idea really silly as well, because if you're gonna buy the entire culture up and with basically and then sell it out as government bonds, it just seems like a recipe for just crashing the entire country's economy into the ground in a way that is basically going to be reminiscent of an entire country basically just collapsing and falling off the map.
Yeah, I highly doubt Moldbug has done the economics on this model.
I mean, I'm no economist, but it just seems like a way of it's like taking the old dog out the back door and shooting it in the back of the head. It's like, why? Just let it fall of its own volition. You may as well.
I do not think that this part of Mencius Moldbug is why people like him, or really the reason why he's a notable thinker. I think this is just a crackpot theory attended to other much more reasonable explanations for how the world works and how.
Well, one thing I guess you could say he might have been getting at was that society needs to be governed in a way that it's more forward thinking, because it seems.
Perhaps I can say this: like Nassim Nicholas, the book I'm reading on audiobook right now is Nassim Nicholas's Taleb's Skin in the Game. I think that's really what he meant. People want a government that feels like it has skin in the game, and I don't think our current government does have skin in the game.
Sorry, you repeat that?
Skin in the game.
Yes.
We don't believe that our current government has skin in the game.
Yeah.
Yes, I
People
agree
don't
with
like
that.
Well, nobody has ownership of the country. Nobody is responsible.
No, more than the term of their own lifespan, right? They don't care about their ancestors. They don't care about their culture. They just care about their particular 10, 20-year political career. Or if you're president, your 8-year political career.
Yeah, and I'd say that that's kind of my main problem with liberal democracy is that it's not forward thinking. It seems to be the focus is just the next 5 years and then the next 5 years, and this is why I would entertain certain ideas such as monarchy or somewhat, I get, not necessarily absolutism, but a lot more I guess you could say autocratic rule, because there needs to be a force that has interests that extend beyond a 5-year period.
Yeah, and I think people in the West have an undue aversion to this. We haven't really had a Western monarchy in hundreds of years, and I don't think you can simply rule out the idea of a modern monarchy working just because you didn't like the one that existed 500 years. I mean, there could definitely be some positive improvements to Britain if the monarchy actually wasn't just a powerless corporation and it actually did something to preserve British culture. I would say.
I feel like we're missing two key messages from Moldbug. The first one is over designing future political organizations. And the other one is, I think there's a certain lack of imagination. I mean, you're absolutely right that skin in the game in a multi-ethnic society is something that monarchy allows that republicanism and multiculturalism does not. But I feel like it's a little bit of a lack of an imagination to say that, well, because monarchy did this better, we can't think of anything else. And I feel that a lot of times our conversation about the real principle we're pursuing when we talk about monarchism is obscured behind just a lot of golden age type thinking about past monarchies, which may or may not be so true.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dave here. I don't think it really matters at all what kind of governmental system we have in 100, 200 years. What matters is that they embody the first principles in which we're discussing here. That as far, frankly, even as somebody who comes from a country with a monarch, I couldn't care less if it was an aristocratic republic, as long as it embodies these things that we're discussing here.
Yeah, so I actually agree with both of you as well. I'm posing the idea, but I don't actually care that much what type of government exists as long as it's a suitable government. It doesn't really matter if it's aristocratic, a monarchy, a democracy even, but we need to escape the idea that democracy is the only form of government it's the end state. It can't be the end state, clearly.
Well, yes. I think that's sort of, ironically enough, I think that's sort of coming down the pipeline. Who's that Ewan Monk guy from Harvard who's all about the people against democracy, like why is democracy becoming so increasingly unpopular? I think that this is the loss of faith in democracy is coming. Yeah. And I think it's coming. I don't think we need necessarily. I don't think tearing down democracy is what is ahead of reactionaries. I think what is ahead of reactionaries is that we need to show that actual authority systems and hierarchies that do have skin in the game can be implemented in the modern world.
Yeah.
And if you can show that, I think the future is yours.
And how can we show that?
Well, I think that this is the real big question that needs to get solved.
Mhm.
I think that this is worth investment. I think that this is worth a lot of articles. I
Do you
think this
think-
is worth going to actual communities and saying how it's constructed. I think it also is.
And you're talking about hierarchies generally, right? Not just political ones.
Yeah, I'm talking about hierarchies generally. And the difficulty is that all we've shown in the internet age is that we can dissolve hierarchies. And that's not, I mean, that's all good and well if you don't like the hierarchy in question. But what we have not shown is that an internet community can be used to facilitate the creation of a hierarchy online, or that hierarchies on the internet can be used to facilitate the creation of hierarchies and well-ordered systems in real life. And I think, I know the internet's, relatively speaking, in human history, young, but I think that that is the next great quest for people who are interested in culture online, especially people who are interested in reactionary culture. I think the person who figures that out is going to have, I mean, I've read a lot of books about building online communities, and encouraging hierarchy of participation and signaling through identity is one of the things that they actively seek to facilitate. Now, this creates things like Wikipedia, but could it be used? Could we take the next step? Could we build something more substantial, more sort of thick than Wikipedia? Hey, I'm all for, this is the thing, like, to go back, not to kind of hijack, but to go back to the previous point, like, small, thick organizations are awesome, right? But, you know, there's small, thick organizations have advantages. Big ones that are shallow have some advantages. They're usually not as good. But a small, shallow one is just one that doesn't really have a critical amount of life in it. And that's what, you know, we have to be aware that we need to be thickening, not exclusivizing. A small community that is thin is engaged in what's called a purity spiral. If the size of a community is kept small so that it can create thick bonds and facilitate some kind of authority and prestige, then I'm perfectly willing to entertain that. Now, for a movement, that might not be as useful, but the direction we need to be asking ourselves is, how do we make communities more thick, not how we make them smaller. Or I mean, I guess I am asking how we make them larger, because I think that as they get larger, you get more chances for people who will accomplish these things. But yeah, it's an open question.
Well, people on the internet definitely seem very amenable to authority. I mean, I'm sure you guys have used tons of forums throughout your many years of using the internet, and there's pretty much always a really strong power hierarchy. You know, you have the admins and the mods, and they have absolute power. There's a clear set of rules. You behave or you get kicked out. If you can appeal at all, it's totally up to their discretion. So it seems that the internet has definitely demonstrated that not only do hierarchies work, but people are highly amenable to them.
Yeah, I think in terms of making a community thick, I think it has to do with well, what are you standing up for? What's this community about? And I think going back to the form of government, I think that a real focus of reactionary movement needs to be, well, is kind of like what Mauritian said, that it's really the first principles that we're fighting for that matter. And really, that's whatever kind of government we have. That's just a tool of achieving this. And you know, because I just think that what really matters to the West right now is its ability to justify, preserve, and continue itself into the future, and really to create a society that its inhabitants can be proud of. And you know, I think we just need to get out of the idea that like democracy is this inherent good, and that going against that, and like that's the be all and end all, and that going against that is essentially heresy. Because I just don't think it's necessarily the form of government that matters. It's what's this society about.
One thing that's interesting in this regard is, you know, Romans are kind of the progenitors of the West in many ways, and the Roman Empire reached zenith under the imperial system after they did away with the republican system, not the other way around.
Well, yeah, but I guess you know, I'm gonna disagree with you here. I think that the zenith of the Roman Empire was just after the Republic ended.
That is true.
Even, you know, all of the vigor that it took to create the great poets came from a Republican patrician culture. All of the energy it took to conquer their vast empire came from a Republican army. You could argue that the Hadrian emperors were good at architecture, but even under them, culture slowly disintegrated. And, after they had their little 4 or 5 generations, everything kind of fell apart in short order.
Yeah, you're right. That wasn't a great example because there was a momentum built up.
Yeah.
I am a fan of the Roman Republic and system to some extent, though. I don't know if you guys have looked into it much, but it had a really interesting system of representation where, based on what class you were in, you had your vote mattered more effectively because you got a differing amount of representatives based on whether or not you were like absolute bottom tier working class or in the aristocracy. Like the people in the aristocracy had a much greater share of representation than the rest of the populace, and that apparently worked very well.
Well, I think is going to be critical. So I think what's going to happen is the thing that we're going to cut our teeth on is that in about 10 years' time, social media companies like YouTube will have totally kicked us off. But I think that it'll be slow enough, and the people who have cool heads will have ridden the wagon long enough that they have built up a following that they can take to alt tech.
I don't understand why they haven't kicked us off now, to be honest.
Well, because they can't. It's because they currently lack the ability to in a way that doesn't cost them. So I talk a lot about warfare and about asymmetry. It's not necessary. They can kick us off, but just because your opponent, and the United States government could drone strike my house too, right? But it would cost the United States more to drone strike my house than I'm doing damage to it by me having my YouTube channel, right? So they don't. When you're fighting a war, it doesn't matter that your opponent can technically kill you. All that matters is that killing you would hurt them more than not killing you. And
I get that.
This is the reason why we're not kicked off of YouTube. Purging the reactionary channels would hurt them more than it would help them at this stage. But what I was going to say is when we build alt tech, we're going to have to come up with a system of organization and ownership to govern this, and to specifically govern the content so that things like child porn doesn't come onto it and ruin the whole thing. And from that, perhaps we could experiment with alternative government forms, alternative views of authority. I mean, these are things that I don't have the answer for. We're just going to have to try them and see what works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this ties into the idea of parallelism.
Yeah, that's what same thing I was going to say.
And I want to say another thing. We need to be comfortable with failing. We need to be able to try something, have it fail, and then try again. If we're not comfortable with the sense of failing, we have to be able to create lots of parallels and have like 99% of them fail. Because that's the only thing we'll ever know what works and what doesn't. This is the thing that Nassim Nicholas Taleb says. He says, like, knowledge isn't gained from some hypothetical understanding of the universe. It's just gained from tinkering. And then afterwards, we describe theory. Yeah. And that's exactly what I'm saying about this this question we have about building societies and building parallel institutions. We need to tinker, and we can't get discouraged if some people fail, right?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to wind it down now. Do any of you guys have any final thoughts?
It's hard to come up with something on a topic this fast.
Oh. Well, go ahead.
I was just thinking out loud.
Oh, that's fine. So yeah, this was a great conversation. Lots of great points were made, and I've linked the book down below, so it's definitely worth checking out. I linked the audio and the text. And I wanted to do a stream on this because I'm going to be talking about some of these ideas in my upcoming videos. I'll put links to these guys' channels. Definitely go check them out. Thank you for listening. Till next time, Endeavor.